AI calling on the Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Okay, thank you. I'll take PI exclusive in the chat. Many people who aspire to be the next generation of great authors are currently prohibited of the choice to become such because either your parents force you to work at a normal job or that you live paycheck to paycheck because you are unfortunately not born into an incredibly privileged family. We think that the development of the technology and the AI technology that allows you to write in the way that you want democratizes the market, democratizes not just the writers as well as the consumers, and we think that is immensely important, more so than the author guild's claim. The first thing I'll do is to explain why author guild is likely going to lose the lawsuit. There are three reasons. First, note that the accumulation of cases and drafting the laws have not caught up with the progress of the technology, i.e., it is incredibly difficult to justify the illegal nature of ChatGPT, particularly because the IP violation of ChatGPT is heavily ambiguous. It's not like ChatGPT is copy-pasting the exact work, but it's rather that the ChatGPT is like, having a mixture of multiple different authors' creation, meaning that it's very unclear to what extent the IP violation is actually occurring. Secondly, note that the IP AI is not directly making profit out of the setting novels, i.e. it is very difficult to quantify the harm that has been done to each individual authors. Thirdly, note that there is a huge backup from technological sector and its supporters, i.e. because IA is a hugely lucrative industry, it is likely that companies like Google as well as Microsoft is probably going to try to finance the OpenAI, and therefore this author guild's claim is likely going to be lost, and therefore you get nothing in this debate. This doesn't wash out the debate because it comes at the trade-off, because being able to get class action lawsuit and thousands of each individual cases is immensely incredibly expensive. It means you have to hire an army of lawyers as well as army of paralegals. It costs immense like billions of money, and therefore we think that trade-off is incredibly bad for the author guilds, because author guild have to trade off the alternative advocacy that they're doing under the status quo, which are more legitimate and which result into clear tangible protection of the authors. For example, things like cracking down on illegal downloading of PDF of the books of many authors, or cracking down on pirate version of the books, or even things like financing on the future generation of authors are much better alternatives in which we can help out and meet the interest of authors. So if this debate and opposition starts talking about the interest of the authors, we get better interest of the authors on our side of the house, precisely because they're likely going to lose the lawsuit, and it comes to the trade-off of many other things that are equally important, if not more. Argument one, we think that this lawsuit is likely going to significantly stifle and slow down the AI development, and this is likely going to be incredibly detrimental. Why is this the case? There are three reasons. One, as I said, class action lawsuit. Even the recipient side is incredibly expensive to hire a bunch of lawyers as well. Secondly, optically speaking, investment from many investors are likely going to decrease because the existence of lawsuit in itself probably is going to potentially alert many investors that other groups might potentially sue OpenAI as well, meaning that the OpenAI is likely going to lose a huge amount of funding. And thirdly, note that if OpenAI loses the lawsuit or are forced to settle with a huge compensation, given that it is a relatively new company with little to no financial and cash flow yet, it is likely that they are not going to be able to develop the technology as fast as they are doing under the status quo. The counterfactual is that naturally we would have more development of AI insofar as there is genuinely a lot of the optimism about AI and development of AI, and that's why, because you can take a lot of the author's work, absorb many books and literatures, and increase the quality of algorithm improves, right? So for example, what happens in near future is that if you type certain topic or certain theme into ChatGPT, the ChatGPT is going to tailor to your need and create a novel for you, for example, and things like that. That is incredibly important in this debate for two reasons. The first is that people now can explore the world of art and literature, because many people, unfortunately, paycheck to paycheck, and these people cannot have access to the lucrative market of writing and becoming an author, because writing a novel takes enormous amount of time, resources, as well as skills. And even if you have great idea, it is very difficult to execute it and turn it into a book. But also we would note that the potential benefits you can get out of becoming an author is speculative, because it's an incredibly competitive industry where you're probably not going to be able to have access to a job in the immediate term. So only those who are privileged enough, who can afford to live without any paycheck for like 2 to 3 years, are only ones who are able to actually become writer in the first instance. By contrast, a lot of the people from the very childhood oftentimes have certain memories that they cherish, oftentimes have certain artistic inspiration that they have in the classroom, for example, and they want to materialize it into something concrete. They want to write books, for example, they want to be a writer, but they cannot do so under the status quo. We explore that option that people can have access to on our side of the house. Secondly, note that the consumers also massively benefit from it as well, because if this technology develops and that people can have access to more and more art creation and novels, it is a good thing, because insofar as people have different lived experiences, it is important that people are going to emotionally attach to different types of work. Therefore, it is only logical to assume that the more and more artwork is only going to be beneficial in being able to provide happiness to people on the ground and being able to, get fulfillment to consumer side on our side. I'll take a PY.
So you started your speech by telling me it's really costs, and then you made your first argument about all the ways in which artists who pour months of work in are going to get shortchanged by people who can just enter 3 lines into ChatGPT. Surely you can't claim both at the same time.
But no, like artists are very privileged people. They can afford to spend 3 to 4 months doing all the work without any clear compensation yet. Okay. Secondly, I want to weigh this material against the potential impact that comes from opposition about authors' interests. There are 3 reasons why we should value development of AI more so than authors' interests. The first weighing mechanism is because development of AI actually counterintuitively leads to authors' IP protection as well. Because under the status quo, a lot of the undercooked AI is likely going to be very bad, because it only copy-pastes the article. It only doesn't take their own artistic inspiration, right? Like it just copy-paste bunch of dudes writing, and they just put it together. It is when the IP violation is greater. By contrast, if it develops, it can think on their own. So by taking a lot of the data, now AI can create their own version of the story. So developed AI actually is going to save the IP protection on our side. Secondly, whether authors can actually claim IP protection when it comes to the OpenAI case is highly, highly ambiguous, because writing is a series of inspiration that you take from other things, other events, or books that you read in the past. That means that you at least take some elements of other books and incorporate it in your books. It is very difficult to therefore assess whether or not OpenAI's IP violation is an actually morally bad thing or not. By contrast, the benefit that we talked about is not morally ambiguous. It is as clear as days. Finally, note that, as I said, authors are likely going to come from privileged backgrounds, but the benefit that we have of democratization of the market accrues to every single one of us, which is a greater in number, as well as underprivileged people. So for these reasons, opening government wins.
Thank you very much for that speech. Before I call on the next speaker, I just want to invite speakers to avoid further confusion, just in case. Please specify which team you want to take a PY from. Okay, with that, calling on Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Hi, can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, cool. 1 second. I'll take PIs in chat, preferably from closing the opening. Go ahead, knock yourself out as well. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to take down OG's case with just one statement. It doesn't matter if you have accessibility to AI for the people on the ground who want to write, when you're never going to get published, when a company is never going to hire you because there are 10 AIs better than you. Insofar as they want to argue accessibility for the poor man who has to work a 9-to-5 job and then can't write, and AI is the only way he gets to write. Sure, maybe he gets to achieve his own pet project of a novel, but it's never going to get published, he's never going to get recognized, and he's never actually going to become an author. There's no company who ever use him when they can use 10 AIs that are cheaper, faster, more efficient, and produce better stories than he ever could using ChatGPT. That is the point in which we have to regulate AI. That is the point in which the lawsuit has to work has to come in order to push back against the fast speed of AI. So the core issue in which OG doesn't want to talk about, it's true, it's protection for these authors. But the main problem is that they're being replaced, and a lot of these companies are replacing them. So OG just misses the entire debate insofar as they argue the progression of AI is able to help both people on the ground who never wanted to become authors, because insofar as they will never become authors because of the way that companies are now using AI in order to write, that doesn't matter. So entire 7 minutes of PM speech just isn't contentious in the round if they don't prove why this accessibility actually becomes something that's good. But secondly, they want to talk about like AI becoming more progressive and therefore growing to a bigger issue. Yeah, that's the point in which you have these same copyright issues or these same versions of AI taking over jobs in every other industry. I think at the point in which we can regulate it now is the point in which we should and we can. Therefore, we're so proud to oppose. I think very simply the burden on government, which they haven't done already, is to just provide for a vulnerable class absent of the lawsuit. We're going to explain to you why other forms of metrics of accountability aren't going to work when you want to hold AI accountable or hold these companies utilizing AI accountable, or we think necessarily they have to provide for vulnerable groups that don't necessarily have the ability to fight against AI, or to have, those groups that run the risk of their jobs being replaced by AI. Those are necessarily the stakeholders you want to talk about. I think top three layers set up if I go into three general argumentations and then a couple of responses, right? First, who the Authors Guild, what they want. I think very simply just a collection of writers. I think they care about three things. Number one, their jobs. Number two, ownership. And number three, sustainability of their jobs. They are the most wealthy. That's why they need this source of income in order to survive. OG wants to argue that these writers are poor. These writers don't necessarily have the luxury of time. Only a small amount of them have the luxury of time to sit around and rest on their laurels and not to gain money. Very true, which is why the point in which companies come in and use this AI to take their jobs, that is when these writers groups are getting mostly screwed over. Number two, what is this lawsuit? In order for Gov to regret the lawsuit even existing, you need to prove two things. Number one, this lawsuit is either frivolous, or number two, this lawsuit is against public good. Insofar as neither PM speech has addressed these two things as to questioning why the lawsuit shouldn't work, we don't think this is something that is really strategic for them to do. So very simply, what we're defending is just status quo, the way that the lawsuit is being used to chase off AIs from taking jobs. I will deal with whether this lawsuit is successful later in my argumentation, but I think regardless whether it's successful or not, the very presence of a lawsuit holding AI accountable, or being in the presence of the lawsuit in order to check the constant and rampant growth of AI is the point in which this lawsuit is just beneficial in and of its net. There's two extraneous responses before I get into three general issues in today's debate. Number one, OG wants to talk about cracking down on pirates as a better form of utilization for the writers group. Guys, pirating costs very minimal for artists. If I pirate a book, a PDF of Pirate Bay, it's not going to take away millions from authors. What's going to take millions from authors is companies buying AI in order to write their scripts, produce their TV shows, rather than authors. That costs millions. I think you have to deal with the actual harm rather than the pirating harm, But number two, on consumer fulfillment, I don't think consumers are a very big part of this debate. Insofar as they want to talk about, they want different forms of options. I think options already exist out there in the market. The problem with consumers is if you give them these forms of options or to choose AI when they can't differentiate, they're going to choose and they're going to make sure they're going to not pick the authors who actually need the money, which means the people that actually require the forms of profit, that actually carry out their work. Those are the ones being harmed. Therefore, one big thing to frame a three argumentations, the ability to hold big tech accountable. I'll take CG later, right? The ability to hold big tech accountable is incredibly important due to the emerging market that exists in a rampant pace. The fact that the market grows so big that we can't really control it and we don't have any checks and balances or levers to stop it. That is the point in which we need this lawsuit in order to exist as a countervailing force, but also the asymmetry of power for those using this AI. Because let's be real, even if the average consumer uses AI, we don't think this is where the majority of the debate happens, because the lawsuit won't affect the ability for the average consumer to use this AI. The problem is large companies using this AI, then defending their right to use it instead of hiring actual workers, and then using their army of lawyers to prosecute anyone who wants to challenge them. That is the point that we should need to protect authors. That is the most vulnerable stakeholder. We think the asymmetry of power makes everything worse. Therefore, three reasons. Number one, why accountability is necessary in the emerging market. Number two, why other metrics don't work. And finally, number three, why the impacts of the lawsuit as a binding precedent, whether it succeeds or doesn't, is something monumental in status quo. Before that, I'll go to CG. Hurry. CG, hurry.
Is your claim in this debate really that George R.R. Martin is a vulnerable actor?
George R. R. Martin is not a vulnerable actor, but he's one man, guys. The millions of other authors are vulnerable actors. Like, stop pigeonholing this debate into George R. R. Martin. There are like 2, 3 big name fantasy authors. There are hundreds of other smaller ones that just don't get the recognition, don't get the money, and don't get the support. Like, if you want to argue on George R. R. Martin, that's not a fair debate. Can you actually like be charitable in this round? I think that's not beyond you, right? 3 things there. Number 1, why accountability is necessary in an emerging market. I think growing markets expand rapidly at this point, right? Companies push this fast because they want to breach into bigger profit margins, and they want to push boundaries as far as possible. We're perfectly fine if countering this or having a lawsuit means that AI slows down, because we think greater regulation matters. The reason why companies do this is because they want to expand into profit margins and make sure there are more money that can be made when they hire less authors, less writers in order to write their books, produce their manuscripts, write their shows. That's the point in which they save money, and that's the point it needs to be done. Those outside, especially these groups that are harmed the most, needs to be the one to slam on the brakes and need to be the one to hold them accountable. Number 2, why other metrics don't work. We look at 2 other metrics. Number 1, public policy, and why legislature can't hold it accountable, because companies have the lobbying power and they want this AI in order to do so. Which is, any policy that government or charitable government is going to run is either, number 1, doesn't exist because companies lobby and kill it, or number 2, they have a lot of holes. And the other alternative to like regulation is social acceptance. Society policing needs to know what to police. So you want to argue that society will police these companies, they first need to be set a bar. They need to let professionals tell society what dictates morality, not companies. So the lawsuit, we think, is the one that will set the bar the most likely. I think finally the impact is why the lawsuit is important, regardless if it succeeds or not. We think if it succeeds, then it becomes binding precedent, holding all other AI accountable, or all other AI to a set of regulations, set of rules that they have to follow, because they can't just learn from anywhere and just accumulate data and publish things that's copyright. But even if it doesn't work, and let's be charitable here, and even if it doesn't work, we think the lawsuit as a countervailing force is enough to dissuade the forms of rampant abuses of AI, to at least get companies to the bargaining table and give them some provision for authors that are necessary. We think that's the point which is important. That's the point we should protect authors. So proud of this.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. Now calling on Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Okay, I prefer POIs in the chat, please. Okay, so starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mainly 3 things to cover. First, reputation. Second, I'll talk about why human authors will continue to exist on our side of the house. And finally, if I do have remaining time, I'll talk about some principal stuff. So firstly, responses. The biggest problem for opening opposition is that their case is reliant on them winning this case, and there is no analysis as to why this is the case. This is already preempted by Prime Minister at the point where we're able to prove to you why, due to so many reasons, OpenAI is far more likely to win and Authors Union is far more likely to lose. We think that at this point, we think that the likely outcome is that there is a precedent law that states that that creation by AI is in fact legal, and this sort of lawsuit is in of itself invalid. This is directly contrary to the interest that OO wants to protect, because at the point where you have an established case law or a precedent law, this is at the point where authors have much more difficulty actually taking down this case. Taking down this case because it becomes authority, and it actually binds further courts that or trials that happen into the future. But the second thing to say is that, well, they say that you're going to like increase like accountability by and protecting authors, etc. But I think that at best the thing that we have to always keep in mind is what sort of actors that opening opposition is trying to protect. We think these at best like a couple of like a dozen like privileged authors defending their own rights, that they're like, you know, they already sell millions of dollars, but you know, it's not like instead of like 10 million they're earning 9 million. This is the sort of benefit that probably opening opposition needs to is probably defending. What we would rather prefer is millions and millions of people who don't have the time to actually create, who wished that that if they were born into a circumstance where they could have get all the education and they could actually express all of the feelings and articulate all the experiences that they had undergone. If this catalysis is able, we can provide to all of the people on the ground by letting them write their own novel that they are going to enjoy by themselves. We think this is the largest benefit that we have so far been able to claim in this debate. Okay, so second, let's talk about why AIs are why on our side of the house, AI human authors are still likely to be competitive. And note this is important because at the point where we're able to prove that AI creation is not in direct conflict with authors' needs, we think that even if we concede that authors' rights are important, we are still able to take this debate. Three analyses here. The first is that people still want to read from human authors as a very basic intuition, because, for example, they want to hear from the lived experience of people who have actually undergone that experience, or their lived words, people who share the same suffering, minority authors who uniquely know their own circumstances. And note that this is inseparable with the concept of creativity, in which only humans are able to generate, because AI at best is only able to generate content that was already generated in the past, and this is not something that is possible. That is something that is uniquely possible for humans. When, for example, dystopian novels came out, or like romanticism in like 18 something came out, I think it might be normalized today, but at that point it was extremely revolutionary because it was a complete destruction of pre-existing trend and a complete brand new creation of something completely new. We think this sort of creation is what people are looking for, what people want from these authors, and this is what we are uniquely able. This is what people are going to uniquely look for on both sides of the house anyway. The second thing is that people are still going to read from authoritative names because of the like the culture, the people who have like occultic character. We think that this is especially relevant in this debate because we're talking about authors' union, which is controlled by extremely big names and extremely privileged authors. So even if, for example, small names publish using the AI, we don't think that no printing company is probably going to respond to begin with. Moreover, once it is discovered that AI is actually being used, it will be not only seen as unauthentic, but also it will be seen as unlucrative, because people are not going to want to like buy a novel that is actually what was actually written by an AI, or it will be seen as a betrayal to to the printing company that was expecting something that was written by a person. But thirdly, I think that what we have to recognize is that ChatGPT literature is a literature that is actually personalized to you. What this means is it doesn't have universal appeal. It might, so when an average person is able to write their own novel with ChatGPT, it might be appealing to their own experience, but this is not going to necessarily be the case if it is done by, if you want to publish it and print it and actually make money out of it, and for all these reasons, what we would say here is that authors' rights are not necessarily in tension with the development of AI. Human authors are still going to persist. I do not think see why opposition's materials matter in this debate so far. Yeah, I'll take a closing.
Is this not knifing all of the PM material? Because now working class authors will now never outcompete privileged authors in a highly saturated market?
No, we never talked about like working class authors trying to outcompete these privileged authors. This was never our case. I'm glad I was able to clarify. What we're saying is these people who are marginalized are able to produce their works that are personalized to their own experience, that uniquely resonates with their lives and their suffering, and read it themselves. And this is the benefit that uniquely we are able to claim. So it's a complete misunderstanding for opposition to say that you're going to be outcompeted by like privileged authors or like big names. We really do not care, because the biggest impact is not about making money out of it. Okay, but rather about emotional fulfillment. Okay, finally, in my remaining time, I'll talk about the principle of theft. But if opening has a POI, I'll be happy to take it now.
Yeah, we do. Why necessarily will publishing companies then publish authors from the working class rather than getting Bob from accounting to type random stuff into ChatGPT and make a book?
Okay, this is the same POI. So this is not our case. Our case is about minority people, distributed people being able to create their own work and enjoy it themselves or share it with their small community. It's not about monetarily like actually starting a business, etc. I'm not going to repeat that. Okay, so finally, let's talk about principle. I think that opposition closing is sort of Clothing might talk about this is about authors' rights. They put a lot of work into it, and this amounts to theft, etc. First thing is that this is probably not theft to begin with, because OpenAI is not directly making profit out of actually selling, like publishing books that were created by ChatGPT to begin with. But second, I don't think that the concept of theft is actually principally relevant to begin with. We think that on both sides of the house, humans also learn from other humans about what sort of thing is valuable, or people learn from other people's styles, etc., and actually incorporate it into their own literature. This OpenAI is just doing the same thing as what a human being is doing. We think that the fact that OpenAI is not necessarily just copy and pasting and printing all of the same thing, this does not amount to the breach of like intellectual property. So I think there's a huge burden for opposition to overcome here if they want to talk about principles. But what we would say here is that the impact on minority people are the biggest impact we have so far left in this debate. So on those grounds, please.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Can I be seen and heard?
Yes, you can.
All right, thank you. POIs in the chat exclusively, please do not interrupt me. I'll take you around the 5th minute, preferably from closing government. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the opening government case is riddled with tensions. Either big tech has a lot of money that they can defend itself against a class lawsuit or class action lawsuit, or they'll be so scared by one lawsuit that they'll take out all their money out of AI, thus infringing upon the development of AI, as what opening government wants to talk about. Or either AI writing is so personalized to you that you can derive personal enjoyment for that, or the art industry is democratized now because you can create art that competes with authors like J.K. Rowling and G.R. Martin. Like opening gov can't have both instances, right? They need to defend either individuals being able to compete fairly in the market, where in which authors, which are not just G.R. Martin or J.K. Rowling, but just literal authors that speaking about their personal experiences, being able to profit off their lived experiences, now losing out to AI that can mass produce art at a point at which humans cannot compete. A few issues that I'll tackle in my speech. The first, on when do we regret lawsuits? And note that opening government has literally zero response to Wesley's argumentation on why lawsuits should be regretted in the first place. Either lawsuits are frivolous in nature, where they waste people's money, which is where opening government's arguments apply, or they are against public interest, or they stifle the rights of individual groups. I think the point at which Gov does not tackle this is the point at which they cannot principally justify why we should regret this lawsuit in the first place, regardless of all their outcomes. We have proven to you why this lawsuit is not frivolous in nature, because it is literally trying to defend against the blatant copyright infringement that AI does, or secondly, it is to protect the right of authors having ownership over their work, and why AI does not have an exemption over copyright laws. Opening Gov does no response to this. Closing Gov needs to engage on a principle level as to why AI either has an exemption to copyright law, or secondly, that they are able to outweigh that in accordance to how AI has more copyright ownership or copyright protections than authors do. The second issue in my speech, why is this lawsuit the best way to protect authors? And I'll deal with both instances where in which we lose or where we do not. I think firstly, we're very likely to win this lawsuit in the first place, right? This is true because there's literal copyright infringement where in which AI is being trained using complete works of different authors. It doesn't matter if you use many different sources, it's what opening government talks about. Thus it's difficult to pick out what is copyright and what isn't, when they literally copy paste entire novels and use that to train their AI models. And that is blatant infringement, not just through copy pasting that work, but literally using that to derive from other sources. The point at which copyright action plays in is where there's blatant infringement, or where there's no human mind that uses that creative source in a way that creatively transform that into another piece of work. I think the law has already made it very clear that AI does not have that human touch that is able to creatively change A to B. The point at which you do not, or you gave that exemption to AI is when they continue infringing in other areas like art, like music. This is the point at which they lose out on any artistic protection that OG wants to claim on their side of the house. It is likely that this lawsuit will work. But even if we fail in this lawsuit, a few reasons why this is still good for us. I think firstly, be able to drain resources from big tech, because if it is true that this class action lawsuit is expensive, what opening government talks about, I think that's a good thing. I don't know why we're defending big tech getting richer at the expense of authors. But secondly as well, this is an avenue for future change. Even if this lawsuit doesn't work, there's unprecedented public attention as to how authors are being now infringed by a new entity in the market, which is a technology that they can never compete with in terms of efficiency, in terms of being able to mass produce work at a point at which they're able to fit in a company's profit margins. We think this avenue for future change looks like, even if we fail in this particular area, we're able to protect the right of artists in other areas like art and music. I think thirdly as well, we are able to bring big tech to the bargaining table. If it is true, like what opening government talks about, that these individuals become scared and that they now pull away investments, we think big tech is more likely to be accountable for the type of material that they use to train their AI and not literally steal from authors to be able to profit on their sense. And note the lie from opening government. It is not true that OpenAI is not profitable. Yes, it is profitable for the people that make this AI in the first place. I don't care if they take a long time to make it and they put a lot of money into it. If you steal, you should be held accountable for this. And second, I think this is likely to be the best form of accountability, because if we don't want to scare off investors, this means that big tech will be careful in other areas as well, like not creating AI-generated art or not putting money into AI-generated music that takes away avenues or forms of or the ability for artists to profit off their own work. Third issue in my speech, which side protects authors the most? I'm going to respond to two things that I hear from opening government. The first is on where authors are able to take out bad AI. I don't know what's the point of this argumentation. If it is true that AI is bad, I think it's going to be bad regardless. Market forces will decide that. But also secondly, opening government talks about how authors find it difficult to create art. I don't particularly see the point of this argumentation. Yes, it is difficult to create art, which is why authors should be fairly compensated for their work and not have it being stolen by big tech to create their own material or to create their own profit-based incentives, right? Obviously, there must be a human mind that creates this art and there's creative touch. I think all these authors have already fought to get their copyright infringement. Even if these are rich authors, they deserve that compensation because they put hard work into creating that. Big tech steals, big tech should be accountable. On competition, opening government argues that that this AI won't compete with its authors, but I don't know why this is true. They argue that consumers have more access to art, or consumers are able to decide for themselves what good art is and not. But I don't think this is particularly true, right? Market forces determine what is good art or not. So if a big tech company is able to hire someone to input like whatever, like the starting point for ChatGPT to create a new piece of art, I think this is more likely to become more profitable for these companies rather than authors that take a longer amount of time or have like disturbances like in terms of their personal life or not meeting up to personal demands. Before 6, I'll take a close PO1 closing. Okay, 6, whatever. The point at which yeah, it's 6. I'm sorry. The point at which companies are able to profit off of mass production of AI, which is more likely to happen outside government when you allow for these companies to get away with blatant copyright infringement, is the point at which you unfairly compete with authors that have human minds and have human labor. They're unable to make art fast enough. They're unable to make art efficiently enough. Companies would flock to AI technologies that are able to make art that is better. So they put more money behind this art, the AI-generated art. They make this AI-generated works of fiction into movies. They profit off of this, leaving humans left out on their side of the house. Fifth issue in my speech, why do authors take precedence over the development of AI? I'm going to first argue why the development of AI is not going to change, even if you remove these pieces of fiction, because it is untrue that you're going to slow down the development of, or at least significantly stop the development of AI, because I think there's many other avenues to train this AI. For example, open source material, or just developing them in other areas like coding, etc. We think AI can still operate in those areas, but even if it is true, we think that is worse. That is a worthy trade-off that we're going to make as compared to protecting authors, because it's not just your most privileged authors that get the compensation that they want. It is those poor people that are able to find time out of the day to talk about their lived experiences. It is individuals that have that creative mind that should be compensated fairly for those issues. On all those reasons, extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now calling on closing government. Sorry, member of government. To open the case of closing government, calling on member of government. Here.
Hello. Am I audible?
Hello, yes.
My apologies if I get interrupted in the middle of my speech. I'm on a university campus sort of late at night. There is a security guard. Her name is literally Karen, who roves around and shouts at people. If I get shouted at during my speech, please bear with me. Hope it doesn't happen. All right. OpenAI is not the only company in the market that is trying to generate language-generating AI. The most likely result in this debate of a lawsuit against them, irrespective of that lawsuit's likelihood of success, although we think the Authors Guild will probably lose, is to turbo fuck that company's market position and mean their competitors have a lot better chances of succeeding. We think that's a regrettable intervention into the AI market because for all the companies trying to create AI, Facebook, Google, governments like China, they are the most transparent about their product and how it's working. This is why they are the easiest company to sue and an actor that should probably remain in the driver's seat of the AI market, which it's unclear in the opening half whether the AI market is on net a good thing or a bad thing. But the reality is that it exists, and the company that sits in the driver's seat of that market probably should be the maximally transparent to government regulation, which I think is the debate-winning contribution from closing government. Two extensions. Firstly, why this intervenes into the market to hurt OpenAI, which is bad. And secondly, that this case is almost certain to lose, which will burn a bunch of capital on an ineffective judicial solution that could have counterfactually been spent on sector-wide legislative reforms to AI, which would be better, and co-opting, I guess, the impacts that opening opposition shoot for in this debate. Let's talk about the first argument. This intervenes in an unfortunate way into the AI market. Premise A, this will specifically punish OpenAI. Because it's a lawsuit targeted at them, fairly obviously, the main reason they are targeted is probably because they're pretty easy to sue, because they've been fairly open about their techniques. They've captured a large market share due to making their product free, accessible to users. And I would suggest that the fact that this will punish OpenAI pretty much exists regardless of whether or not you believe the case will be successful. I think it's almost guaranteed that a case that stands to shape the entire AI industry is likely to get a whole lot of media attention. And at the very least, even if it loses in the end and OpenAI wins the case, it's still a lot of pretty terrible PR for them and a lot of uncertainty for them. But if it does win, as opening opposition seem to suggest, that only helps us because it creates a cycle by which they keep getting sued, by which investment into that company crashes, by which that company eventually loses a huge part of its market share. So this punishes OpenAI. Why then is OpenAI superior to its competitors, which we broadly think in this debate are Facebook, who's trying to generate meta AI, or Google, who's trying to generate Bard, or lots of governments who are trying to generate language-generating AIs that are not given names at the moment. And I would suggest the reason that OpenAI is the most superior is because it has by far the most open culture about the development of AI. It has put out public use for free of its products. It's been fairly transparent about the way that it has utilized public use of its product that was half-baked at the point of its release to improve that product. And I think it's also a startup, unlike any of the other things in the market, which means it has far less incentives like the other actors who are extremely large corporations to use user data to, for instance, usage of AI that is ultimately used for another purpose, things like military technologies, for instance, which Google hopes to use its AI far more for. Compare these with Facebook and Google, which have a long history of obfuscation of the ways that they operate, both because they have more capital to obfuscate the kinds of things they're trying to do because they have bigger and older companies, but also they have a long empirical history of doing this. See, for instance, how Google fucks over creators on YouTube because they have obfuscated the kinds of regulations that they operate with and the algorithms that they use. But they also have more incentive to do so because they plan to use their AIs that they roll out to consumer markets for ultimately private military uses and for other paid services, which means that if they gained a larger part of the market of AI, they'd be much harder to regulate because they'd both have more capital and incentive to obfuscate the kinds of things they're doing. We would suggest everyone who's trying to generate AI in the market has done exactly what OpenAI has done, which is scraping some of the largest sources of writing in the world, like George R.R. Martin's extremely long and boring books, and made them into great sources for language generating AI. What changes now is it becomes far harder to actually scrutinize what is going on, far harder for regulators to get into a glimpse at to what's happening, which we think is bad. Why is this enough to intervene into the market to really punish OpenAI and make its competitors succeed? Because this is a court case that has the wealth of authors like George R.R. Martin and the interest of a broader public who is interested in regulating AI behind it. This is going to get a whole lot of media attention. It's going to get a whole lot of money spent on it, which means OpenAI is going to have to spend a lot of money fighting the case, and it's going to receive a lot of negative PR, which is enough to intervene into it. This is a debate-winning contribution because it bypasses two axes of uncertainty that you might have after the opening half and in this debate in general. First, about whether or not this court case will actually win. The mechanism of this argument is just this case case itself generates enough negative PR and enough costs for OpenAI that it punishes them in the market, which means that you don't need to believe that it loses or wins in order to believe the impact that we describe. You do need to believe this in order to credit opening government's argument and for opening opposition's argument. But secondly, it also bypasses the question about whether AI is actually a good development that's good for people in general. If you reckon it's good, this will stifle good AI development. It will hand over control to worse actors that are more difficult to regulate, who will do worse harms with AI. But if you reckon AI is bad, well, you probably should do some harm minimization and give the biggest market share to an open company that has a willingness and a demonstrated willingness to edit its products in concordance with consumer demands, which this will hurt, which is ultimately counterproductive, which I think co-opts the opposition bench's metric quite successfully in this way. Let's take opening opposition.
Yeah, are you saying that just because an AI company is good, they're able to get away with blatant copyright infringement?
You are being uncomparative. Every other AI company in the market, like Facebook, like Google, is going to do the exact same thing. They are just less transparent. The reason that the Writers Guild chose OpenAI is because they revealed that they are doing this. It's like naive of you to believe that not every company that's trying to generate language generating AI is doing the exact kind of thing in this debate. That failure to be comparative is why you and the rest of the opening half is irrelevant. This sets an unfortunate legal precedent, as the case will lose and it will waste regulatory momentum. The biggest new reason we provide at CG is just that free use is a very powerful legal defense. This is why people can have YouTube videos where they literally just sit and replay someone else's YouTube video while they sit silently and react very peremptorily in the background. There is a video of you just watching someone else's video and eating. That is not copyright, even though perhaps according to our intuitions, it ought be, because the boundary of what constitutes critique or fair use is deliberately set low, because legal systems have to be a bit agnostic about what constitutes fair use of a product, which means, I think fairly squarely, scraping someone else's product in order to create a new product that is entirely new for generation of language probably constitutes fair use in a way that eating food while you watch someone else's video also does. Counterfactually, the momentum will be generated at easier things to do to channel people's actual will to regulate AI into legislative change that actually is directed towards regulating AI, which co-ops OO's desire to regulate AI and its harms quite successfully, I think, and gives us the most direct account of the result of lawsuits. In the end, OpenAI is good and this suit will lose. CG.
Thank you very much for that speech. To open the case of closing up, calling on member of opposition. Hear, hear. Member of opposition. Okay.
Can you guys hear us? Are we good?
Yes.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay, cool. I mean, the other way they start.
Yeah, no worries. I'm assuming I can be heard.
Yes, you can be heard.
Okay, cool. Panel, the biggest impact in the case of the lawsuit winning isn't anything to do with OpenAI. It means that all other much larger, harder to regulate companies now preemptively strip these data sets from the analysis and stop the damage before it starts. This is both on a larger scope, time frame, and uncertainty than anything. This is on a greater time scale, uncertainty, and scope than anything OO said. I want to note the stance of closing opposition, because I think it's very different from other houses in the debate. We recognize that IP rights are inherently illegitimate. We recognize that monopolies often utilize these as a way of assertion and a way of power and creativity. But what we do recognize uniquely is that the lawsuit is a way in destabilizing and delegitimizing IP rights as a general construct, irrespective of whether or not OpenAI wins or loses, which means we are in favor of the lawsuit insofar as we can prove to you that it leads to disillusionment with IP rights in and of themselves. In that case, we're able to co-opt a lot of government's arguments. Firstly, we want to note that very clearly, this debate is probably going to occur in two fronts. Firstly, OpenAI is either going to win or they're going to lose. We think it's quite likely and justifiable for them to say that OpenAI is probably going to win because it's a larger company, it has more funding, blah, blah, blah. But we think that at the point at which OpenAI does win, it sets a precedent where IP rights in and of themselves are illegitimate. This is because it leads to evolving IP regulations, because we mean that lawmakers are going to have to reevaluate the way they update intellectual property. It means that you can probably recognize people as being the sole proprietary owner of something, but they don't have exclusive rights over that thing in and of themselves, which means that the extension of laws is also good. Why then do we think that IP laws are illegitimate? Why do we solve that on our side? Firstly, notice that IP laws are morally arbitrary grounds. We think that whether or not you're smarter, whether or not you're born earlier, whether or not you're rich enough to publish something are all morally inconsiderate of the fact that you own something. An idea may pop into your brain that doesn't make it yours. You were granted that by virtue of luck. The fact of the matter is that in many cases, IP laws are an extension of that. But secondly, we think that IP laws artificially restrict everyone else's right to attain a common good. And this is because it stifles innovation and creates monopolies that prevent others from building upon existing ideas and technology. Disney has all the rights to things such as Mickey Mouse, which means at the point at which other artists want to create things or like reenact things such as Mickey Mouse or mouse-like characters, Disney is simply going to sue them, which means we are capable of stripping away that in and of themselves. But fourthly, I think we're capable to have a unique recognition that creation doesn't mean ownership. You can create something, you're probably going to be granted the rights over that in and of themselves, that people are going to recognize that you are the sole creator of that. But that doesn't mean that you have the exclusivity in owning that, which means that we think that creators can receive recognition without having to own that in and of themselves. But fifthly, we think we're able to limit the overreaching and abusing that occurs when monopolies utilize this as a way of stifling innovation, as a way of squashing competition and stifling free speech. And in order to protect their creations, they often lead to like over-imposing like IP law regulations. We think that in that case, in the instances where OpenAI does win, we're capable of proving to you why it's a good thing, because IP laws lead to like the lack of, which means that on the positive impact scale, we lead to like the reduction of IP laws. I'm going to impact why I think IP laws are so hindering and why it's so problematic. Firstly, open collaboration. We think that if you abolish IP laws, or if you remit like some of it, we think it's probably likely that collaboration within like OpenAI and collaboration within AI developers is good, because you're going to be able to build upon existing technologies and research without legal constrictions. This often leads to the acceleration of innovation and the development of AI application. But secondly, reduce costs, because without the need to pay licensing fees or deal with like IP-related legal issues, the cost of developing AI technologies are inevitably going to decrease, which means AI is going to become more accessible to a wider range of individuals because you don't have that startup cost as well. But thirdly, innovation and acceleration. We think that if you're going to remove IP laws, it means like a culture where each company competes over another, which means innovation can exist to a greater degree because we're not worrying about hindering or infringing on others' patents or copyrights, which means we're able to have a more diverse and creative artificial intelligence solution, which are able to like deal to greater degrees. But fourthly, I think the democratization of AI is a unique impact that exists on our side, because we think that the monopoly power of large corporations means that AI startups are incapable of succeeding because they fail to recognize that there's a high legal cost, and most AI startups don't want to incur that legal cost, thus aren't going to enter the market in and of themselves. But secondly, even in the instances where we do fail, even in the instances where the small guild are capable of like overtaking OpenAI, we think that it's still good for the reduction of IP laws for a simple fact. And this is because that if OpenAI loses, it means that it has to heavily restrict on the data sets that it draws from. Comparatively, open source anonymous like creators do not have to worry about things like IP laws, because as it is implied, they're probably anonymous, and hence they can probably easily train programs using superior data sets than those of like OpenAI. This makes them more competitive than corporate AI, and that's good for a number of reasons. Firstly, it democratizes access. Secondly, it increases innovation. Thirdly, it increases the awareness in and of themselves. I'm going to quickly take the POI before I impact all this further.
Okay, so many forces in society push for free and open innovation of AI to begin with, like lobbyists and investors. So then is there any delta in your side by just this case happening?
The delta on our side is a legal precedent that is set. We think that in many cases, you operate in a gray scale on your side. When we're able to establish a clear precedent, it means that it's good. Even in instances where we fail, we think that the democratization and the innovation of like smaller startups where people aren't held accountable is still good, because a large degree of these startups where they're able to outcompete things like ChatGPT means that the government has to pave in later on down the way anyways, which means in many cases we're capable of actually benefiting all the things that you claim while also being able to weigh over our opening. I'm going to quickly prove to you two questions, and this is whether or not authors truly deserve IP rights. And the reasoning here is that every single individual gathers inspiration from the world around you. We think that in many cases, on their side of the house, even the authors who claim that these things are their unique creation probably read Harry Potter when they were 6 years old and probably gathered some level of creation and some level of inspiration. ChatGPT does the same thing. We don't think you're supposed to regulate on that. But secondly, on the side of which side actually benefits authors, especially smaller ones, we think that when you set the precedent that protects using ChatGPT, smaller artists who use ChatGPT can now face up against Disney, can now face up against bigger corporations, because bigger corporations no longer hold these people accountable. But thirdly, we think that we're able to recognize that artists are creators on our side while not giving them the exclusive right of that thing, which means you're still going to be able to recognize that J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter. It's just she doesn't control everything that exists in that, which means if there's another like wizard that comes about in another story, she can't IP ban them. But secondly, I want to note that in many cases, AI is in its very rudimentary stages. It's very highly likely that AI is going to become very good in the next couple of years. In things like decoding protein cells, where we have large biological advancements, we think that on their side, at the point at which this precedent doesn't exist, these kinds of AIs are never going to be able to learn from things like scientific papers that exist in the status quo. We think that on their side, at the point at which OpenAI likely wins, or even at the point where they lose and governments have to pay in, it's probably very, very likely that you're going to have the abolishment of like overall IP laws, which means these kinds of AIs are capable of operating at greater levels of like innovation and greater degrees of freedom, which means they're going to be more effective. So proud to stand on closing opposition.
Thank you for that speech. Just a quick reminder to take note of your time. Judges won't be writing past 7:15. That's a briefing. With that, calling on Government Whip. Here.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's speed run this debate. OG can't win because there's more than one AI, which means their slowing down of AI development is not particularly comparative. OO can't win because they require the lawsuit to succeed to protect writers, but they have a single, very weak mechanism to explain why this is the case. And CO has to get the donut because their entire case is 2 sets of knives to their opening. I will explain each of these problems in a second. Let's deal with CO. The first reason they lose is they double knife, as I explained. And the way they do this is first to say that IP is bad, despite that is the mechanism that OO provides to protect current writers. So that's a clear and obvious knife, which makes their arguments that rely on that premise invalid, which is almost every argument. And the second claim they make here is that OpenAI would win this case because they're richer, and then that proves why some IP law changes. That again obviously is in contradiction to the opening, who says the lawsuit would not resolve in this way, and in fact the Writers Guild would win this, which would set a positive precedent. So I shouldn't flip that page over again. So that's the double knives, which is why you should probably throw away most of their arguments just because they cannot work with their openings, and their openings are clearly the ones you have to take precedent. The second thing I'm going to rebut here is an idea they have around competition. And the bizarre thing about this competition is they try to sidestep the obvious case here, which is precedent would hold any other AI company to account by saying you have kind of gray AI that's legally dubious and is kind of non-enforced, which means this AI gets better. This is one of 2 actors. Either this is just national governments like China that we talk about at member has probably been kind of problematic and not nearly as open as in comparison to OpenAI. So this just falls to the trap of our first extension. Or the second is this is kind of just like people in their sheds, which obviously that analogy doesn't really work anymore when you're talking about computers, but still sounds funny, so that's why I said it. And these people probably just build AI incredibly slowly because they have access to very little computing power. And even if they do make good AIs, it's very hard for them to distribute those AIs before one of these writer guilds people find out that they're breaking IP and copyright laws and just sues them again with a preset precedent, which means they'll win the case very quickly. So this is not a benefit, it's an incredibly tiny one if it is, and in fact, we think it's a harm. The best claim, however, provided by CO is the thing they say at the start of their introduction but never prove, which is they say that larger firms that use AI will kind of will get rid of AI in their kind of current products because they're liable to be sued. I think this is actually a good idea, but it is not their extension. You can't count it if Whip explains this argument. But of course, this also falls to the claim that you need to win the lawsuit to do so, which either they are reliant on their opening for proving, or they knife their own argument here when they attempt attempted to prove that OpenAI will win the case rather than the Writers Guild. So CO has to get the donut. Let's talk about OO, who's probably getting the second or third. I'm going to try and explain why they get the third, because I reckon OG should get the second here. The first thing that they tell us in this debate is that the first problem is that their sets of arguments around protecting writers are reliant on winning the lawsuit. And the only actual mechanism they're able to set here is an explanation that copyright is clearly being violated when you take a piece of work and then use it. And they use this linguistic trick here where they're like, you copy and paste it, and then very quietly and quickly say, into our AI where it learns from it, which, as I think a number of other speakers, in fact, their closing explains, is obviously just the process in which individuals read something and then are inspired by it. So this is obviously just something like fair use, which actually we explain again at Member is even more widespread than simply the idea of consuming a piece of media and then building something else based either on it or its ideas. We in fact explicitly explain that it is legal to copy parts of text and explicitly reproduce them, as long as you don't say, this is exactly mine, by doing things like reacting to that piece of media, say a trailer for a movie or something like that. That is fair use, that is legally fine, and the context in which we're talking here means it's not particularly restrictive of how you use it. So the legal case is actually deeply unclear, and I don't think this mechanism is nearly sufficient for OO to claim their huge benefit, which means their benefit is incredibly speculative there based off a law case. They think they're going to win, we think they don't. The second extension they provide in this context is to explain that they'll kind of sidestep this claim about we need to win the case by saying, well, maybe just having the lawsuit will scare these actors into coming to the negotiation table, which means we'll get some sort of like industry regulation without having to have this lawsuit available. The first thing is, obviously, if this company thinks it's going to win, then maybe it'll just go forward anyway. So this is a pretty speculative benefit. But the biggest problem with this argument is they don't actually properly explain it. Like, let's say they're correct, they get to the negotiation table. What table? Who's at the table? Like, what things are they actually arguing for in this negotiation table to lead to some sort of regulation benefit? It is an incredibly incomplete argument from OO in this case, so you should not credit either their protection of authors nor their claim that they get protection outside of the lawsuit. OO, do you want to defend yourself again?
Yeah, that doesn't engage with the bulk majority of what we said. Just as by seeing the way the Writers Guild has come to a conclusion in the bargaining table means that we can technically extrapolate same amounts of protections for these groups. Why isn't it the same?
Because this is not a strike, which is the comparison you're making to here. This is a lawsuit. Like the reason, what you're trying to get here is that you threaten a lawsuit and the company says, oh, no shit, I don't really want to go through the lawsuit, so we'll go to the negotiation table and make a deal. But of course, if you think if OpenAI thinks they're going to win the case, which every other team bar you in this debate thinks they will, then they obviously will not go to the negotiation table. They'll take the they take the lawsuit to court and just win. Second, even if you think your mechanism still works, you needed to, in your substantive speeches, not a POI, a gov whip, explain the benefits that are provided for this. Let's then explain our extensions. These get no responses from alt members, so they have a lot of work to do at alt whip to rebut these. We first explained that OpenAI is just a better company than either Google or Facebook or IBM or a country like China or Russia, or honestly, even countries like the UK or the US are developing that. And that is because they are far more open about how you might regulate this process, what this AI looks like, and what things it is able to do, which means that we're far more able to get an AI that will exist, because no world stops AI existing or being prevalent or powerful, but we get an AI that is better regulated, better understood by people, so people understand the trade-off and harms of it. And the biggest problem here is because OpenAI is a startup, it does not put its AI just in its own products and then make its own products compete better in other contexts. E.g., they don't have a word processor that they now make better because they have AI. Instead, they're a company that can sell that to anyone else, which means they can't form monopolies in any other context, which would lead to our harm of poor AI monopolizing a context in many other situations, does not spread and contage other situations like this. So we get a product that is much better, it is much safer. Frankly, AI just says less racist shit, is more safe and doesn't give you false information and costs far more in our world. And in a context where AI is going to develop, that is obviously the prevalent outcome. We finally quickly explain how regulation and political capital is used up by this lawsuit. We'd rather use that for a public policy process, or does attempt to preempt this, but I think incredibly weakly. Very proud to go.